Yeah, it was like these elaborations on the written law. It was elaborations on what it says in the book of Deuteronomy or Exodus or whatever, so they could apply it, right? They wanted to apply the law in every part of their lives, and to do so, they developed these elaborate additions and interpretations of the law so as to make it more clear how it could work. So Paul seems to have been one of these Pharisees. He seems to have been well educated, particularly in Greek. He writes Greek well. Some of the gospel authors didn't know Greek very well. There's like grammatical errors and stuff in the Gospels. Paul's Greek is pretty good Greek. In addition, he probably was trained in rhetoric. I'm not going to really talk about that because that would sidetrack me. But he was well trained for a first century person. Probably wasn't elite, but probably semi-elite in his training. In addition, he was a devout Jew, and he never gave up on that. From before he had his Jesus experience to after he had his Jesus experience, he considers himself a devout Jew. He doesn't see converting to Christianity as converting away from Judaism. He's not like, oh, I went from being a Jew to being a Christian. He's just a Christian Jew, right? Judaism and Christianity were not necessarily separate things at the beginning of this tradition in the first century. And Paul maintains his Jewish identity throughout his life, from what we can tell from his writings. However, he did, in fact, convert to the Jesus movement. Presumably he gave up some of his Pharisaical ways, so to speak. He had an experience of Jesus of some sort. Maybe he had a mystical vision. Maybe he saw Jesus' body. Maybe Jesus came and talked to him in a dream. He claims to have had some sort of experience with Jesus. Now, this would have been after Jesus died, rose from the dead, and went back to heaven. So apparently Jesus came back down to talk to Paul. He had some sort of experience, and there are accounts of this both in his own letters and in Acts, though the ones in Acts are probably elaborated upon. But even in his own writings, he says, I had this experience where Jesus came to me, he talked to me, he gave me a message, and it was after that point that he began following the Jesus movement. He seems to have retained the apocalypticism both of the Jesus movement before him and of first century Pharisee apocalypticism, or whatever we want to call it, right? There were a lot of apocalyptic guys running around in the first century in Judaism. And Paul seems to have been one of these both before and after his conversion. He seems to think that the end is coming near, and we're going to talk about that. One of the things that he's talking about in Thessalonians is they're concerned that when is Jesus going to come back? He thinks that the apocalypse is going to be near. Alright. Now things get a little bit more complicated. What are Paul's views on the law and substitutionary atonement? Substitutionary atonement is a technical term. I'm going to explain it in a minute. Now, according to the Gospel of Matthew, what's Jesus' view on the law? Yeah, we got to follow it, and what else? He suggests that we need to follow it more strictly than we already have been, right? In the Gospel of Mark and in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus emphasizes the law, although he does a lot more in the Gospel of Matthew. Look, you have to follow the law. If you're going to be one of my followers, you have to follow the law, and you have to follow it more strictly than you already have been. That's a no-brainer feature of any first century Judaism. Nobody in the first century in Judaism really rejected the law. Everybody would have accepted the law. Now, by contrast, Paul rejects the law. Paul suggests that if you become a follower of Jesus, you no longer have to follow the law. So here I'm talking about Paul. Unlike Jesus, Paul says that you do not need to follow the law. Yes?
How did that play out with him being a Pharisee and the oral law?
Well, presumably that was one of the things of his Pharisaism that he completely rejected. Right? I mean, that would have been a super key feature of Pharisees in the first century. Look, not only do you have to follow the law, but you have to follow the oral Torah in addition to the written Torah. Jesus seems to have somewhat similar position in Matthew. Paul, by contrast, after his conversion to the Jesus movement, says, no, you don't need to follow the law any longer.
And how is he still considering himself a Jew?
Well, for him, he would define his Jewishness along the lines of something else other than the law. He seems to have followed the law himself. Right? He doesn't say that I stopped following the law. He just says that you don't need to follow the law. So he probably did continue to follow the law after his conversion experience. But he told the Gentiles that you don't need to follow the law to be one of us. Does that make sense? I mean, we're going to talk about this when we get to the letter to the Galatians. He tells some Gentiles, you don't need to convert to Judaism to convert to Jesus. He separates those two things in ways that probably Jesus himself, I doubt, would have. So Paul says you don't need to follow the law, and what replaces the law is substitutionary atonement. Now let me try to explain what this means. This is a technical term, again, from Christian theology. To begin with, what does it mean to substitute?